Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon or evening. Welcome to our Joseph C. Memorial Lecture in person and online with Professor Margaret Hunt. Before I start, I have to deliver a warm welcome from Claudia Jatubowski, who unfortunately cannot be in Bonn today, but she will be with us in spirit or online. But this gives me the honor and the pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, and Margaret Hunt, that I should keep it short. So this is what I try to do. Margaret Hunt is a professor emerita from Uppsala University in Sweden. She is a social and cultural historian with a focus on modern European history, but European history in a global and tangled sense. I think this is important. Her expertise lies in gender history, the history of sexuality, the history of law and maritime and military history, including the Indian Ocean Route, South Asia, and the English East India Company. Margaret Hunt has published a lot. I've gone through her publications. A lot of the publication matches our topics, slavery and dependency studies, even more match our thematic year, gender and sexuality. But I just will mention three of her publications for the introduction. The first is The Middling Forward, Commerce, Gender and the Family in England, 1680 to 1780. It was published in 1996. And I think it's a classic of gender history. It's focused on gender, finances, and class formations in the 18th century. The other book that matches our thematic year is The Woman in 18th Century Europe, published in 2010. And it's a rethinking and revision of the history of European women of the modern period, going beyond Western Europe, including Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire, Jewish, Muslim, Christian women, and also the topics colonialism, work, and slavery. And the third publication I want to mention is a co-edited collection of primary documents with Philip Stern. And the title is The English East India Company at the Height of Mughal Expansion, a soldier's diary of the 1689 Siege of Bombay, with related documents published in 2016. And the last thing I will mention is the Prize Papers project you were head of, I think.
One of the many.
One of many.
Yes.
And it has been funded between 2019 and 2022. The title is Pursuit of Global Knowledge, Scandinavian Ocean Travelers 1650 to 1810. And it's the first systematic study of approximately 3,500 Scandinavian ships whose papers lie in the National Archive in London. And I guess the project today comes out of these prize papers.
Same court, different.
Okay. But the title for today's presentation is Lascars, Peons and Sodomy in the Red Sea in the 17th century. I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and thank you to you all for coming out on such a horrible day. Really, like when I saw the weather, I was like, nobody's going to be there, but thank you. So, this away a little bit. Organize stuff for a second. So let's first have a map. In February of 1648, an English East India Company ship named the Falcon, commanded by one Andrew Trumble, set off from Surat in northwest India for the Red Sea ports of Mocha and Suakin. You can see on the map, sorry, those place things are so big, but there's basically where Surat is in northwest India, on the northwest Indian coast, Mocha down there in what's now Yemen, and Suakin on the other side of the Red Sea in what is now Sudan. So, some weeks into the voyage, a love or lust affair began between two members of the crew. One was Abdul Rahim, or Rahim perhaps, of unknown age, a married man, a Muslim, and the servant of the Falcon's captain. The other was John Durant, 16 years old, a Christian, and a carpenter's apprentice, originally from Stepney in London. And here's sort of the cast of characters that I'll be talking about today. Neither Rhyme nor Durant seems to have made much of an attempt to keep their feelings a secret, at least not from Rhyme's Indian shipmates. One of these shipmates, one Sahid Jalal, later reported, quote, one time having seen Rhyme play with the boy and kiss him, end of quote. He added, quote, I reproved the accused, that is Rhyme, for it, asking him if he were not ashamed. Whereupon the accused gave me 3 or 4 cuffs on the ear, saying unto me, what hast thou to do with me? In other words, what business is it of yours? It is possible that the couple was a bit more discreet amongst the English crew, but it's hard to know because, and it wasn't a very big ship, so just very difficult to know. This is just a bunch of terms that I don't want to spend time defining as I talk. But let me just add one term that I forgot, and that is a very important term, and that's the city of Surat, which was the most important port of the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, and also a very important departure point on the sea voyage to Mecca, and also where the headquarters were of the early East India Company. But it's very much a Mughal-controlled town. So soon after the ship had left Mocha, bound for Suakin, things took a dangerous turn. Rhyme had apparently been begging Durant for some time to lie with him, offering him gifts and demonstrating by word and deed, such as putting his yard in his hand, as Durant puts it, to demonstrate what he wanted. At some point, Durant gave in, and on the night of March 31st, Rhyme buggered Durant either twice, according to Durant, or 3 times, according to Rhyme. Unfortunately for them, the last time they were discovered, or at least noticed by the ship's caulker, a man named Nicholas Griffin, and by 2 English passengers. Griffin, who apparently fell over the pair in the dark, later testified that he saw Rhyme with the boy under him, and finding that suspicious, came back a short time later with a light to find Rhyme gone, quote, and the boy was crying. One of the English passengers later reported witnessing Rhyme hastily tying up his breeches, and a second passenger said he heard the boy say that Rhyme had been lying on top of a bale and had fallen on him. So they're both making excuses. After this encounter, Rhyme became convinced that the Englishman would tell the captain and that the captain would kill him. Now recall that Rhyme was Captain Trumble's servant, an issue to which we will return. In search of advice, support, or perhaps religious reassurance, he started confessing or announcing to all the other Indians what had happened, repeating over and over again to dozens of people, it sounds like, that he had buggered the carpenter's boy, that some Englishmen had seen them, and that when the captain heard about it, he would certainly kill him. At least 9 people described as Hindustan peons, and peons in this context means servants or perhaps dock laborers, and 2 banyas, that is Indian merchants or brokers, later claimed to have heard the story from Rhyme's own lips, and others heard it from their mates. So it was all over the ship, all over the Asian side of the ship anyway. Rhyme also apparently made a special approach to the Lascars, 4 of whom later testified to that effect. Now here, Rhyme, though he was a servant and not a Lascar, clearly was seeking the support of the best connected Asians on the ship. And we can also tell that the Lascars had a lot of prestige from the fact that no less than 3 out of the 4 who gave depositions had done the Hajj to Mecca, which would have enhanced both their individual social and political capital and their religious authority. In the depositions they made some days later, all the Indians claimed to disapprove of what Rhyme had done. Haji Ibrahim, who may have been the sarang or the head Lascar, and the Haji in front of his name shows that he had done the Hajj, claimed that he had pronounced rhyme, quote, a base rogue to be so guilty of so horrid an act, and added that, quote, amongst Persians he had heard it had been often done, and here's he's meaning sodomizing of boys, but never amongst their Hindustan people, nor did he ever know it done in any ship that ever he was in before. Haji Ibrahim, as you can see from this account, also lectured rhyme on self-control. He could not understand why rhyme hadn't waited until they got to Suakin, quote, where you might have had women enough as you might have had in Mocha. And here he's reflecting the apparently standard belief of the time, both in South Asia and in Europe, that either gender could be the object of desire for almost any man. Another man claimed to have told rhyme, quote, that Muslims ought not to commit such acts. And several reported having quoted to rhyme variants of the adage, as thou hast done, so shalt thou be rewarded, which is a common refrain in the Quran and the Hadith. And also there's versions in other languages. That just happens to be a sort of type of that you often find. Rhyme did not just talk about the captain killing him. He also started to make preparations, including giving all his worldly effects, $10 and some clothes, over to one of his shipmates, saying to him, quote, brother, whatever becomes of me, deliver these things to my wife, end quote. In the meantime, he endured some painful treatment from the other Indians. For example, some of his messmates, that's the people who are in the group that he eats with, claimed to have stopped eating with him, so essentially that he'd been ostracized from their group. He was also called rude names, especially by the Lascars, such vile names as he deserved, is how one of them puts it. Several people also in their examinations expressed sympathy for the boy, as the records always refer to him, presumably in line with the notion, common in early modern Islamic contexts as well as Christian, that the passive party in sodomy became personally and physically diminished and degraded as a result. Now, you can never fully believe what you read in legal depositions, and the Indians, as well as their translator, felt under some pressure to express disapproval of their shipmates' behavior. And by the way, here's the confession of Abdul himself. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to assume that the expressions of disapproval were only for show, especially since, as you can see in this confession, rhyme was quite explicit about having penetrated the boy. All of these people were Muslims, except for the two Banyas who were Hindu, and perhaps a Hindu, according to my informant in Surat, and a Parsi. And sex between men is and was often condemned in the Islamic sources, most notably in the Quran. The main references in the Quran, for our information, have to do with Lot and the destruction of Sodom, which is referred to in several suwar, and here's one of them. Both in the earlier accounts of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 of the Hebrew Bible, as well as in the references to it in the Quran, there is some unclarity about exactly what the sin of the people of Sodom was. So, I mean, when you read straight off, I mean, both the Quranic account and the biblical account, you wonder, was it inhospitality to travelers, as some people have said, men lusting after other men, rape, the rape of angels or messengers from God, which is very clear in both versions. And also specifically, it's unclear exactly what sex acts were the problem. Now, despite the lack of specificity in the original, in practice, there was, I hope you can see this because it's a bit small, but I'm trying to sort of outline some of the issues here. In practice, there was general, though never unanimous agreement in the Islamic sources that sodomy meant anal intercourse between men. But there was also a large body of debate across all of the Islamic schools of law, both Sunni and Shiite, going back at least to the 8th century CE, as to the seriousness of sodomy. So, for example, whether or not sodomy was a zina crime, and also if it wasn't a zina crime, whether the death penalty was ordained or not, which in turn hinged on a hadith whose authenticity had long been in doubt. In fact, were in doubt already in the 11th and 12th centuries. So there's a lot of debate about this question in the Islamic legal sources from very early on, and over many centuries. So one of the striking features and questions then has to do with the Islamic world, and it has to do with the fact that at least before the 20th century, despite all this talk about sodomy, efforts to punish sodomites by legal means were extremely rare. Now, modern scholars offer three main legal and cultural reasons for this. First, sex acts usually take place in private, and all the schools of Islamic law had high standards for legal witnesses. So generally, to convict for zina or other serious crimes, there had to be four, although in the Hanafi school, which happened to prevail in the Mughal Empire, two respectable Muslim males who had actually seen the act taking place. This meant that sexual crimes very seldom came to court, much less resulted in formal punishment. Secondly, there was a strong aversion in most systems of Islamic law to people who made false or unprovable charges, particularly about sexual crimes, with the person making the unproven charge, and as we've seen, it's very hard to prove it, being very severely punished for having made the original unprovable charge. And this obviously deterred people from coming forward with accusations. Third, there was a widespread belief that publicizing other people's crimes, particularly if they're debased or degrading crimes like sex crimes, reflected badly on the honor of the community. This also extended to people publicly confessing to sexual sins. So that the ideal instead, and there's several hadith to this effect, statements by the Prophet on this issue, suggesting that the ideal was, to the extent that one can generalize, to stop doing whatever sinful thing you were doing and repent in secret. So rather than going into the whole zina crime, punishment, court, etc. Now, it's very unlikely that a group of Gujarati sailors and servants would have been aware of all of these long-standing but higher-level conversations among legal scholars, though some of them may have shared the reluctance to air dirty linen in public. What they would have known was that legal proceedings against sodomites were vanishingly rare, which I take to be at least part of what Haji Ibrahim was suggesting when he claimed, most implausibly, that he had never heard of such a thing in India. Still, Rhymes and Durant's situation was now complicated by the fact that the entire South Asian side of the crew, and at least two of the Banya passengers, had either heard Rhyme confess to having buggered the boy or had heard the story from others. Now, clearly, if the notion of repenting in secret ever rose to the level of a social ethic, it had passed Rhyme by. Still, days went by and nothing happened, but Rhyme kept insisting that the Englishmen were going to tell the captain and the captain was going to kill him. And when about 10 days later, Henry Gary, who was the highest ranking East India Company factor on board, sent for Nicholas Griffin, one of the men who had caught Rhyme and Durant in the act, Rhyme immediately assumed that it was about the sodomy incident and that his secret was out. At this point, it seems that Rhyme, already very committed to the confessional mode, decided the safest thing to do was to go all out and tell everybody, not just the other Asians. But he tried to do it on his own terms. Having first tried to get help from the Lascars, he now enlisted Henry Gary's manservant, a man named Sidi Jamin, as an intermediary. Rhyme asked Jamin to tell Gary what Rhyme had done from Rhyme's perspective and to offer the excuse that he, that is Rhyme, had been enticed by the boy. Apparently, the hope was that a man-to-man conversation with Gary would get him to understand the situation, that anyone could be tempted by a beautiful boy, particularly on a long voyage, is what we can imagine Jamin telling Gary. And Gary would then intercede with Captain Turnbull to keep the situation from getting out of control. It is clear that the Indians, though some or all of them may have disapproved of sodomy, saw Captain Trumble, who was both a heavy drinker and a pretty volatile person, as the primary problem. They were not thinking in terms of a series of laws or rigid religious prescriptions concerning the punishment of sodomy, whether Islamic or Christian. Rhyme clearly was a sinner, and he certainly lacked self-control, but he did not deserve to die for it. Moreover, we have to remember that they were on a ship in the middle of the Red Sea and not in a court of law, and it probably did not occur to any of them that either of the two delinquents was in serious legal jeopardy. If Sidi Jamin succeeded, Rhyme would probably be punished but not killed, and if things turned bad, he could jump ship at Suakin, which was only a couple of days away. The boy, no doubt, would also be punished in some way, but not severely. After all, he was just a boy, and as well, he was English, and the whole, as if this all worked out as they anticipated, the entire embarrassing episode would be behind them. Well, how wrong they were. Immediately after Sidi Jamin talked to Gary on April 11th, 1648, Gary informed Captain Trumble, and both Rhyme and Durant were immediately put in irons. The very next day, on April 12th, a consultation was held with 9 Englishmen, including Henry Gary, who probably presided, Andrew Trumble, and 7 others, most likely officers, factors, and captains. Things immediately shifted onto a very different discursive plane. First, the company conducted the examinations and heard the confessions of both Rhyme and Durant. Rhyme, as we've seen, was already fully committed to telling everything, and apparently he convinced Durant to do the same. Here is Durant's confession or examination. And unfortunately for both of them, Rhyme's and Durant's well-meaning attempt at full transparency, which you can see right here, provoked horror instead of sympathy. The men at the consultation were frankly amazed that the two accused had freely admitted to the, quote, sodomitical sin of buggery, a fault which all Christian ears cannot hear named, much less know acted. Their behavior, the committee members thought, had already caused, quote, the dishonor of our national and our Christian profession by the dishonoring of Almighty God, whose honor in the first place ought always to be principally aimed at. And this had great consequence, as it put them all at risk of divine punishment. Still worse, Durant had, as they put it, committed this vile act with a heathen. Now, you might think that if sodomy was this horrific, it wouldn't much matter who you did it with, but you would be wrong. Behind that last claim of committing a vile act with a heathen lay a whole set of other anxieties that probably stemmed originally from the enslavement of Christians by Muslims, especially the privateers of the Barbary states. In the early modern period, both Muslims and Christians in the states and statelets around the Mediterranean engaged in extensive slave raiding, most often by attacking shipping of the other side. And there were, as a result, tens of thousands of Christian slaves in North Africa and the Ottoman lands, and at least comparable numbers of Muslim slaves in Christian Europe, especially on the Italian and Iberian peninsulas, and at Malta. Not surprisingly, the English did not much concern themselves with the plight of Muslim or Jewish slaves in Christian lands, but they felt deeply for the Christian slaves in Muslim lands, particularly the Protestant ones. Most Christian slaves were male, many of them were in fact sailors, and the captivity narratives by the former slaves, that is, people who'd been ransomed back, which were a popular print genre of the day in many European countries, and certainly in England, often raised the specter of young Christian boys being sodomized or groomed for sodomy by their Muslim owners. The sodomy was seen in turn as a ploy to get captives to convert to Islam, presumably by weakening them physically, spiritually, and morally. I mean, everybody believes that whoever they are, whatever their religion, that's what happens when you're sodomized by someone else. Thus, for the English, sexual vulnerability, the status of being the passive partner in an act of sodomitical sex with an older Muslim, real or metaphorical enslavement, as well as conversion to Islam, were causally linked and in fact almost inextricable from each other. The issue of conversion was especially fraught for the English East India Company because English soldiers and sailors rather routinely deserted their ships or their settlements and converted to other religions, primarily Islam, not least because the Mughal army paid a lot better than the company did. Some higher status men did too. In March of 1649, just a year after the events we've been discussing so far, one of the company factors, who were pretty elite people, a man named Joshua Blackwell, to the, quote, dishonor of our nation, betook himself to the governor and, quote, most wickedly and desperately renounced his Christian faith, professed himself a Moor, Muslim, was immediately circumcised, and is irrecoverably lost. All this helps explain why the men of the consultation very quickly concluded that, given the seriousness of the offense that had been committed against no less an authority than God himself, no mere corporal punishment could possibly be enough. The consultation felt somewhat hamstrung, however, first because a group of only 9 men did not have the authority to impose the death penalty, and the company did usually try to follow English law in capital cases. Moreover, they could not execute Rhyme because he was a subject of the Mughal Empire, and there was a rule that was part of the agreement between the Mughals and the company that they wouldn't impose capital cases on Mughal subjects. And yet, the men at the consultation also professed to be deeply anxious that if they showed any leniency at all, the result would be an epidemic of sodomy on their own ships. And so, quote, for a terror and example to all who are now with us, and, quote, to deter all others from this like crying sin, they sentenced Abdul Rhyme and Jean Durant each to 40 lashes that same day, to be soundly laid on, and afterwards to be washed with salt and water, followed by 20 more on the following Monday, and then 10 every Thursday and Monday, followed by washing in salt and water, to continue until the ship got back to Surat. The consultation also stressed that this was to be, quote, only a present punishment given them to keep others from perpetrating so damnable an act. Both Durant and Rhyme, if they survived the trip back, and the men at the consultation thought they might not, and you can imagine what that must have been like in the heat of the summer, if they made it back alive, they were to be tried a second time in Surat. Now, actually, no, let me see what time it is. I'm going to actually skip this little part and return us back to Surat and the second consultation. It must have been a long and terrible trip back for Abdul Rahim and John Durant, because it took 5.5 months for the Falcon to get home to Surat. Once there, the pair of them were imprisoned in irons for several more months. And finally, on 18 January 1649, another consultation was held at Swali Marine, port of Surat, this one attended by the president, council, and ship's commanders to figure out what to do. This group, like the earlier one, felt it could not punish Abdul Rahim further without offending the Mughal emperor. So instead, he was remitted to the justice of the Mughal governor of Surat. Now, no court records for Surat have survived for 1649. For other periods in the 17th century, there are. But it is unlikely that Rahim was subjected to a court proceeding or to more punishment, since the number of lashes he had already received far exceeded what Hanafi jurists inflicted for non-zina sexual crimes. And it was, as I've said, a non-zina crime for the Hanafis. They probably let him go. And at this point, all mention of Rahim ends. But the ordeal continued for John Durant. The new Consultations members were in no doubt that Durant and Rahim were guilty of the most abhorred fact of sodomy, and they had the 2 confessions to prove it. Moreover, the new committee had 12 men on it, the necessary number to render the death penalty. The question before them was whether, quote, we might proceed against Durant with greater severity, such as the laws of our land impose upon such wretched offenders. In plain terms, could they impose the death penalty? And again, a problem arose. It appears that some people thought the shipboard consultation the previous April had been premature and had exceeded its authority. Even a crime of a heinous nature, that was their term, like sodomy, could not be punished twice. And some of them argued that the floggings, washings with salt, etc., barred the new committee from imposing a second and harsher punishment. In the end, the committee was unable to agree, and the decision was made instead to send John Durant back to England for the East India Company directors in London to decide his fate. The ship, the Aleppo Merchant, was departing for England only a week hence, and Durant would be on it, secured in chains every time it came near land so that he could not escape justice. As far as anyone in Surat knew, and that would include the rest of the crew of the Falcon, both Indian and English, Durant was being sent to his death. Now, some of these men may have fastened on the double jeopardy defense as a way to avoid having to execute Durant. But others certainly thought he should die for all the reasons mentioned earlier, but also because their sense of corporate responsibility seemed to demand it. Only 12 years before, in 1636, the then company president at Surat, the president just means the head of the factory, the head of the area, one William Methwold, presiding over a different sodomy case, had invoked the story of an East India Company captain suspected of buggering cabin boys. Though the man escaped punishment from earthly authorities, God was believed to have wrecked his ship in retribution. Now, if you believe that God delivered collective punishments for crimes that humans had neglected to suppress, then severely chastising people who broke God's law became as much a business imperative as a religious one. However, despite having a professed sodomite on board, the Aleppo merchant's journey home seems to have been both short and smooth. Less than 6 months later, the ship was back in the English Channel, having come in with 6 other East India Company ships, the most that had ever arrived up to that point in the company's history. The parliamentarian's execution of Charles I had occurred only 6 months previously, and the atmosphere in London was tense. The company jumped into the breach by putting in place plans for a celebratory dinner and a special sermon of thanksgiving for its returning ships. This is the sermon which was then printed on celebrating the return of the ships. And one of the main themes of that sermon was an exhortation to company stockholders to force their sailors, who were said to be a sinful lot on the whole, both to fear God and to worship him. Devices like mandatory shipboard worship were necessary, quote, for the preservation of their lives, meaning the sailors, your ships, and your commodities from divine punishment. In short, we could think of this as a kind of corporate responsibility under God. The company also moved to curry favor with the parliamentary regime by selling the high-quality saltpeter its ships had brought from India to the Parliamentary Council of State. Saltpeter, as people will probably know, being the main ingredient in gunpowder. In 1657, these and similar policies would bear fruit when Oliver Cromwell awarded the East India Company the new charter that is generally considered to mark the beginning of a more modern, as well as a significantly more expansionist enterprise. It was this incarnation of the company that in later years would become the leading edge of British imperialism in South Asia. There is no record of who decided what to do with John Durant, though it is very possible William Methwold, who's him with a past experience of East India Company sodomy cases, had a voice in the decision, because back in England, he had become deputy director of the company. Whoever made this decision, about a week after the Aleppo merchant arrived, John Durant was handed over to the Admiralty Court, which handled crimes and disputes on the high seas, to determine whether he should be formally charged with sodomy. At the hearing, the examiners, both of them eminent jurists, had in front of them the records of all the other examinations, as well as both Rhymes and Durant's confession. In fact, they had exactly what we've been reading from so far. Now, not for the first time, one has to wonder why Durant had confessed in the first place. I presume that Rhyme, that soul of indiscretion, convinced Durant that it was the best move for both of them. But it begs the question, did Durant really not know what a serious offense sodomy was in English law? And it makes one reflect that one of the risks with a sin not to be spoken of by Christians is that some people, particularly young people, just may not get the message. And clearly Durant had not. But by July of 1649, John Durant had had plenty of time to educate himself on the law of sodomy, as well as to reflect both on the wages of sin and the dangers of full transparency. Moreover, he or his family may also have consulted a lawyer. This time, faced with a new set of examiners, Durant did a complete about-face. As the examination puts it, he utterly denieth the same, meaning the fact of sodomy, and being charged that he had confessed the said fact formerly before the English president and council at the East Indies, he likewise denieth the same. Durant did admit that he had been punished for sodomy. He would bear the marks of it for the rest of his life, but not that the original crime had ever taken place. And this is the record of the rather confusing examination. I mean, the poor guy must have been terrified, including the crossings out here. And that's a snapshot of John Durant's own signature at the end where he signed the statement. At this point, as with Rhyme, the trail goes cold. There are missing records for part of the 1650s, but it seems unlikely that Durant was ever tried, and even less likely that he was executed. The criminal side of Admiralty relied on jury trials, and it is hard to see how a repudiated confession about events that took place 6,000 miles away, all the witnesses to which were back in India, could easily have resulted in a conviction. There was also the double jeopardy issue, which was real. And even in England, there was a certain reluctance to capitally punish boys. It is true that the more zealous of the revolutionaries were pressing for harsher punishments for sexual crimes, but most of the resulting convictions come from after 1652. So maybe Durant finally caught a break. We cannot be entirely sure, but it seems that both Rhyme and Durant were saved by the legal conventions of their own lands. Though after what they had been subjected to, Durant especially, we can only guess at what psychic and physical cost. The story of Rhyme and Durant involved a series of pretty spectacular cultural clashes and misunderstandings, from wildly differing notions about how existentially dangerous sodomy was, to Abdul Rhyme's misplaced belief that truth-telling was the best way to bridge cultural difference. Did these conflicts have any longer-term implications? Well, they may have had for the one central figure in this drama who we have touched upon relatively little so far, and that is the Falcon's captain, Andrew Trumble. Now, you will recall that Rhyme was Trumble's servant, and that the whole early part of the story was driven by Rhyme's seemingly pathological fear that Trumble would kill him. You may also recall, well, you don't need to recall because it's right here, Rhyme's confession in English, the point is made, is in English, where he exhibited a fluency with English sexual terminology that suggested that this was not the first time he had buggered or been buggered by an Englishman. This impression is reinforced by Durant's confession, especially the colorful sexual metaphor belay belay that Durant attributes to Rhyme, a usage that implies strongly that Rhyme's prior sexual contact had been with one or more English sailors. And belay, I mean, it has a shifting meaning, but in the 17th century, it seems to mean surround or enclose as with ropes. So what Rhyme is presumably using, the sense he's using it is, you know, let me in, take me, something like that. Now, Rhyme's contemporaries were not naive, and they would have known perfectly well who the most likely person to have instructed Rhyme in this terminology and these acts was, and that was Captain Trumble himself. There is an interesting parallel to the case alluded to by Methwold in his sodomy case, which had also featured a possible miscarriage of justice, in that it was widely believed that an innocent person had been executed in place of the real sodomite who was the captain. And then the captain's ship is wrecked upon the rocks by God, etc. The master who buggered his manservant or slave was not just a staple of Christian captivity narratives, it was also a stereotyped scenario for virtually all acts of sodomy, including between two Christians, and it turns up over and over again in English and other European literary and journalistic depictions, as well as in actual court cases. And here's a cheap pamphlet about the most famous 17th century sodomy case of all, which is that of Mervyn Touchett, second Earl of Castlehaven, which is actually a very complicated case, but he's essentially decapitated for abetting the rape of his wife and for buggering his manservants. So, and everybody knew about this case. And I should say also that sodomitical sex between masters and servants or masters and slaves was also a very familiar theme in the Muslim world, including in the Islamic legal debates. Now, let me hasten to say that I have found no direct evidence in the records that Trumble and Rhyme had sex, but in a way, it doesn't matter. Other people in East India Company circles and on board the Falcons almost certainly suspected them of having done so, especially given Rhyme's repeated claim that the captain was going to kill him when he found out, which made him sound more like a jealous lover than like a master. At very least, suspicions would have been raised about Trumble's heavy drinking, his shameful inability to police his own servant, and whether he had ignored similar behavior from Rhyme in the past, which, if you believe in the judgment of an angry God, could have put the whole ship at risk. Not long after that second consultation, the one in Surat, in January 1649, things began to go downhill for Trumble. In April of that same year, the Falcon departed for Basra in the Persian Gulf. The trip took a long time because of the need to wait out the monsoon rains, and by the time the Falcon got back to Surat in late November of 1649, the entire ship was in turmoil. 25 members of the crew submitted a petition to the president of the company at Surat, complaining of Trumble's tyranny and refusing ever to serve under him again. In a separate declaration, two of the company factors, Englishmen, charged Trumble with refusing to give one of them his allotted cabin, abusing and threatening them, and beating their Indian broker. Other charges were that he promoted a crew member who struck a superior, bought and sold his own goods to the detriment of the company, lent members of the crew money at exorbitant rates, appropriated the effects of sailors who had died, withheld water and other necessities from the native passengers, and at Basra threatened, while drunk, to fire the ship's guns at the town, in addition to robbing orchards and killing ducks. The long litany of charges, major and minor, and especially the private trading accusations and the refusal of the crew to serve with him again, were too much for the company. And after a hearing in Surat, Trumble was dismissed from their service. After the dismissal, which at Trumble's request was initially kept secret, he was allowed to continue to lodge and take his meals at the Surat headquarters, but his drinking grew worse. He became increasingly abusive and offensive, and several times had to be locked into his room because of his raving, threats, and claims that people were spying on him, which in fact, it turned out they were, as you can tell from the many reports they put in about his unspecified filthy habits. Finally, Trumble was banned from the Surat factory, from meals, and from religious services, and got his own rooms somewhere in town, where he continued to drink heavily and make abusive remarks about the company and its Surat leadership, and to spread destructive rumors. After a great deal more conflict, agreement was finally reached to send him back to England, and in February 1651, he sailed home for home on a ship rather inappropriately named the Love, alongside Joshua Blackwell, the former convert to Islam, who had now returned to Christianity, but was sent home in disgrace. Neither Blackwell nor Trumble would ever work for the company again. So what had happened with Trumble? He was accused of so many crimes and offenses that we can't be sure. But it is interesting how apparently unanimous the opposition was to him from the people of the Falcon, including the Lascar crew, English factors, the factor's English broker, and the native passengers. It is certainly possible that all of this was the result of Trumble's clearly rapidly advancing alcoholism, erratic and violent behavior, and corrupt dealings, but one does have to wonder whether his equivocal role in the sad events of the previous year played some part in poisoning his reputation, especially with the Asians on the crew. And if he had conspired to punish others, even unto death, for a sin he too had committed, well, to quote one of the Indian examinants, "As thou hast done, so shalt thou be rewarded." To conclude, this story first caught my interest because it seemed to offer a window onto the lives of Lascars and other Indian maritime workers in a time period, the 17th century, where they have been little studied. This case also shows the interactions between Lascars and other people on the ship, including peons, largely unstudied category as far as I can see, passengers, both Indian and English, the English part of the crew, including the carpenter's crew, and both Lascar and English officers. In this case, it seems that the Lascar's main contribution was to offer moral advice, and Rime, after all, was not himself a Lascar. But if they did seek to intervene more directly, we simply have no record of of it. And it certainly was not for lack of effort on Rhime's part. I mean, he clearly wanted them to intervene. Because this is the story of a sodomy case and an interreligious sodomy case at that, it also offers some other potentially useful vantage points. First, it is a way to look at differing cultural and legal responses to a set of acts that both Christians and Muslims viewed as sinful, but that in practice they dealt with in quite different ways. I don't want to overstate the difference, though, because historians of sexuality here will know that there are many periods in Christian history where there was very little interest in prosecuting sodomites. Still, I think that in the 17th and 18th centuries, there is a contrast to be drawn, and that doing so takes us a small step toward a more global picture of gay and queer history than we often get. Second, this case gives us an opportunity to think about the contrast between, on the one hand, the company's highly rhetorical and alarmist claims about its honor, and on the other hand, its real geopolitical position in India. Now, in case it wasn't obvious, the consultation handed over Rhime, though it pained them to do so, because they were terrified of what the Mughals might do if the English broke the conditions that permitted them to trade. I think that the melodramatic as well as highly imbricated religious and sexual fears expressed by the company, from Muslims enslaving and sodomizing sailors, to Englishmen converting to Islam and getting circumcised, to an avenging god sinking their ships, all speak powerfully not only to the dangers and psychic ambivalence of global trade, but to the fact that in this period, the company was almost completely dependent on the goodwill of the Mughal emperor, an almost inconceivably powerful Muslim. Finally, and this was an issue I didn't really talk about because I was skipping around, there is a question about whether these heavy punishments that were imposed on Durant and Rhyme were because that first consultation was really worried about sodomy in their ships. And there have been some arguments that sodomy was much more common than we thought, although I don't think, at least among sailors in the early modern period. So that's kind of what I'm responding to. So I'm responding to the question of whether what they're really concerned about is fraternization between South Asians and Englishmen on East India Company ships. So on the one hand, in ships and other places, Englishmen and South Asians had to work together to trade, to sail ships, to supply basic needs. This is actually my last point. Moreover, English sailors, especially in the 17th century, had many reasons to want to befriend Indian ones, because the Indians had knowledge of languages, trade conventions, what goods were in demand at different ports, and so on, that would have greatly enhanced English sailors' ability to operate in what was to them a radically foreign land. Closer connections to and cooperation with Indian sailors and other natives would also have reduced English sailors' sometimes abject dependence on the East India Company. Conversely, the company feared these kinds of connections between lower-level English employees and Indians because they saw them as undermining their already tenuous control over their people, which I think is one of the big themes of this whole story. In the final analysis, I doubt that there was an epidemic of sodomy on board the Falcon or other ships engaged in the country trade, but I think it is quite likely that people were striking up interreligious and interethnic friendships or business connections that the company found threatening. In 1648, the men of the company elite were in a far weaker position than their counterparts would be a century later, when the East India Company seized political, military, and fiscal control of a significant part of India. In 1648, they were still feeling their way, and the affair between Abdul Rhyme and John Durant was just one reminder of how daunting a challenge that was. Thanks.